Oh, whoa, whoa, don't be scared. It's just me.
Hi, I'm Meredith. And today I'm going to show you how I made a vintage trick-or-treat pail cookie.
Cookie pail. Pail?
Let's just call it a bucket. And I don't mean this vintage, more like this vintage. I tried a few different ways of baking the 3D shell, but neither way was really what I was looking for. And then one day at work it dawned on me. Bigger is better. And so here we are rolling out a very thin cookie for a very large dome. Thickness, it's 1/16 of an inch rubber guards that we have. I ended up rolling the dough with another piece of plastic wrap on top of it to prevent it from sticking to my rolling pin. This way I was also easily able to fold it backwards, and I have my 6-inch sphere dome lightly sprayed with baking spray. Cover. There we go. I smoothed out the wrinkles of the cookie dough like I would if I was covering a cake in fondant, gently lifting and pulling the dough so that the dough fell flat against the sphere. And then I used a knife to cut away the excess dough, keeping the line as straight as possible. I also cut half of a circle into each of the domes because that's going to be the part where our top of our cookie is open, because we have to have a place to dump our treats in. And then make a second half sphere the same way you made the first. And these are going to go into the oven at 375. I checked them at the 10-minute mark, and this is what I found. Okay is right. I anticipated that these would spread, but not as much as they did. However, all hope is not lost. These weren't fully baked at this part, so I did go ahead and trim them again, and then I put them in the oven to bake for about another 8 to 10 minutes. When they come out, they're beautiful and golden and crisp, but then also a bit stiff. So I learned from an earlier disaster that these need to come off the half spheres immediately while they're piping hot. So I use the edge of a knife to lift the bottom part of the dome. And once the edge was lifted, I used this small plastic scraper that I have, and I really pushed it up inside the dome very carefully so I didn't crack the cookie, or as little cracks as possible, to get this off the half sphere. I filled in hairline fractures with a very sturdy royal icing. But really you want to work with a cookie that has very few fractures, or else you get smashing pumpkins. So keep that in mind. You may need to practice these domes a couple of times before you get them right. I sure did. Because I was going to be adding a lot of weight to the outside of this dome, I needed to stabilize the inside to help make this sturdy. So I'm using a thicker icing in orange, and I'm going to put it into the center and kind of pull it out towards the sides. I'm doing this for both halves of my domes, and then I am letting this dry completely. If there are any jagged edges, you can use a knife or a grater to scrape those away and make this nice and flat and crisp. And you want to hold both of your dome halves up together and see where they may not be fitting together perfectly, and that's where you can trim. Once you're trimmed up, you're going to use that same thick royal icing to coat the entire outer side of the domes. We're going to put fondant on top of this, and we want to make sure that the fondant has something to stick to. So coat the entire dome, let this dry, and we'll move on to the next step. Next up, we're rolling out some orange fondant, and if you don't have orange fondant, you can make some just by mixing in some orange gel food coloring into your fondant. Before coloring my fondant, I rub my hands with a little bit of shortening, and this helps the color to not stick to my hands as much, and it also helps keep the fondant pliable. When you have the shade you want, dust your workspace with a little bit of cornstarch and then roll out a pretty thick piece of fondant. And I measured the width and height of my dome, and I made sure that my fondant piece would cover the entire dome. So if it was 6 inches across and 2 inches high, I need at least 8 inches plus a little bit more to make sure this covers completely. When your fondant's ready, dampen the icing on the dome with a paintbrush and some water. This will give the fondant something to stick to. Cover your dome and lift and pull the fondant to make sure that there are no creases and air bubbles. And then flip it over, making sure the fondant is folded over the inner edge. Smooth out any finger marks. Now using this fondant tool, we are pressing in lines from end to end to make the different segments of the pumpkin. And I'm just doing a few random lines, just trying to keep them equally spaced, but you can really do however many you'd like. After we paint it, we're going to set it aside and let it dry so that we don't continue to make finger marks. And we're only doing this for the front part of our pumpkin right now, but we will get to the back half a little bit later. Now the most exciting part, we're going to put a face on our pumpkin. I'm going to make this face here something that reminds me of my little bucket as a kid. I'm keeping my reference photo close by, and then I'm going to use this fondant tool to sketch in the eyes, nose, and mouth. And I wanted this to look a little recessed, so I'm pushing down the eyes, nose, and mouth with the other end of my fondant tool. And I'm also blending any of the lines that I put in my pumpkin out. I'm using a Wilton black food coloring, and it already is pretty smooth, so I'm not adding any additional water or alcohol to this. And I am going to paint my eyes, nose, and mouth black. I let the front half of my pumpkin dry for at least 24 hours, and now it's time to cover the back. So I'm following the exact same steps as I did for the front half of my pumpkin, rolling out some fondant, and then dampening the royal icing on the other half of my dome and sticking the fondant to the icing. While this half of the pumpkin is still soft and pliable with the fondant, I am dampening the entire edge with water and placing the two pieces of my pumpkin together. I thought I could put a piece of fondant on the bottom and have these both stand up and stick together, but it was too weak and this really needed to dry very sturdily. So I ended up taking a piece of tissue paper, and because the front of my pumpkin is nice and dry at this point, I put that face side down on the tissue paper just for added cushion, and then I let this dry face down. I buffed out any hand and fingerprints, and then I used my fondant tool again to add the lines in my pumpkin. I let these two halves dry together for another 24 hours, and then I had to realign how this was standing. It was a bit crooked. So I took another piece of fondant and put it on the bottom and adjusted it until it was standing upright. I cut away excess fondant and then blended this right into the base of the pumpkin. I also wanted to make sure the edges were neat where the two cookie halves met. So I used a little bit more fondant, cut it into a thin strip, and then placed this right across the seam using a little water to make it stick, and then gently pressed it into the side. The last step was the fondant handle, and man, was this thing a pain. I ended up rolling out a pretty thick piece of black fondant, and I draped it over a wine glass, and you can see I had a piece of parchment paper on the side of the wine glass, and I let that sit overnight. I thought I was going to be able to stick this on with just a little bit of fondant and some water, but it was way too delicate for that. When I did finally get it to stick, there was a little bit too much pressure, and it kind of like a spring just popped right off of the pumpkin. So after a lot of trial and error, I decided to use toothpicks, and I cut them down, and then I put them in the center of a piece of fondant, and I stuck that piece of fondant to the inner parts of my handle. And then once again, I did have to let this sit and dry for a while so that it was nice and sturdy. Then finally, I was able to make it stay with the toothpicks. I had to really take some time to push them in, and then I took a little bit more fondant around the base of the handle and I blended that in. So much work went into making this. I look back and think maybe bigger wasn't better. But in any case, the piece has been completed and I learned a lot along the way. I'm excited to share this journey with you, and I hope that you found some new techniques to take away. But truly, if you do try this and you have any questions, please leave them in the comments, and good luck!